The tectonic plates of the global economy are shifting rapidly. And today, the epicenter of that movement is not located in Washington, Beijing, or Brussels. It is unfolding in Oslo, Norway. In a breaking and highly consequential development, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has just landed in the Norwegian capital for an emergency, high-stakes summit with the leaders of the Nordic nations, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. He is not there for a routine diplomatic photo opportunity. He is there to execute what trade analysts are calling a geopolitical escape hatch. Faced with the crushing weight of President Donald Trump's aggressive new tariff regime and what Ottawa views as escalating American economic coercion, Canada is attempting to build an economic fortress outside of Washington's reach. By aligning with the Nordic bloc, the Canadian government is taking unprecedented, historic steps to decouple its most critical supply chains from the United States. Today, we are examining the mechanics, the risks, and the profound global implications of this bold maneuver. Why are the Nordic countries the perfect partners for a Canadian economic rebellion? How is the Trump administration responding to what it views as a direct threat to American industrial dominance? And what does this mean for the future of the Western Alliance and your wallet? Let's get into the details. To fully grasp the gravity of this emergency summit in Oslo, we must first look at the intense pressure cooker of North American politics over the last several months. For nearly a century, Canadian economic policy could be summarized by a single, unwritten rule: stay closely aligned with the United States. The two nations share the longest demilitarized border on Earth. Their economies are so deeply intertwined that they exchange over $2 billion in goods and services every single day. Since the automotive pacts of the 1960s, through NAFTA, and into the modern CUSMA era, the integration of North American manufacturing has been an unquestioned reality. But under the current America First doctrine of the Trump administration, the old rulebook has been incinerated. Following a landmark Supreme Court ruling that blocked the White House from using emergency national security powers for unilateral, sweeping tariffs, the administration executed a hard pivot. They activated Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. This formidable piece of legislation allows the United States to impose indefinite, highly punitive tariffs on any nation it deems to be engaging in unreasonable or discriminatory trade practices that burden American commerce. Historically, Canada enjoyed a special protected status during U.S. trade disputes. But the Trump administration has made it abundantly clear that exemptions are a thing of the past. Washington's position is uncompromising. The administration argues that reshoring American manufacturing and protecting the domestic industrial base requires a hardline approach, even with the closest of allies. The U.S. Trade Representative has stated that if foreign nations, including Canada, undercut American workers or serve as transit points for cheap overseas manufacturing, they will face severe, unrelenting tariffs. Facing the prospect of long-term economic strangulation, Prime Minister Mark Carney has made a monumental choice. Instead of capitulating to Washington's demands or waiting for the tariffs to dismantle the Canadian economy piece by piece, he is actively seeking to circumvent the United States entirely. This brings us to the core of the Oslo summit and a revolutionary new concept in global trade: middle shoring. For decades, the dominant corporate strategy was offshoring, moving jobs to developing nations with cheaper labor. Recently, the United States has pushed friendshoring, trading exclusively with fully compliant allies who align with Washington's strategic goals. Carney's strategy is a radical departure. He is attempting to rally the world's middle powers. These are advanced democratic economies that are wealthy and technologically sophisticated enough to possess real leverage, but small enough to be highly vulnerable to superpower coercion. Why the Nordics? The synergy between Canada and the Nordic countries is profound and deeply strategic. First, they are all resource-rich, highly advanced democracies with a shared, aggressive commitment to green energy transition and technological innovation. But more importantly, they share a distinct geographical reality that is becoming the most contested real estate on the planet: the Arctic. As global temperatures rise and the Arctic ice melts, new, highly lucrative shipping lanes are opening in the high north. Control over the Arctic is rapidly becoming the next great geopolitical frontier. By binding Canada's northern strategy with Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, Prime Minister Carney is attempting to create an integrated Arctic economic bloc. This proposed bloc commands massive natural resources, state-of-the-art maritime technology, and critical, fast-moving shipping routes that bypass traditional American-controlled sea lanes. But the immediate urgency of this summit is centered on something even more foundational to the modern economy: critical minerals. The 21st century economy runs on elements like lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earths. These materials are the absolute bedrock of electric vehicle batteries, advanced microchips, renewable energy grids, and modern military defense systems. The United States is currently in a desperate race to secure its own supply chain for these minerals to compete with China. Canada sits on massive, untapped reserves of these exact resources. Historically, Washington operated under the assumption that those Canadian resources would naturally, inevitably flow south into American factories in places like Michigan, Ohio, and Texas. Carney's summit in Oslo threatens to completely upend that assumption. According to sources close to the negotiations, Canada and the Nordic bloc are discussing a framework for a closed-loop, transatlantic supply chain. Under this proposed agreement, Canadian raw materials would be extracted and shipped directly to highly advanced, environmentally clean refinement facilities in Sweden and Norway. They would bypass the United States entirely. In return, Nordic green steel, advanced robotics, and cutting-edge renewable energy technology would flow back into Canada at zero tariff rates. For Canada, this represents an extraordinary escape hatch. It provides a lucrative, high-tech market for their natural resources that is completely immune to the stroke of a pen in the Oval Office. It fundamentally dilutes their total reliance on the US dollar and American consumer demand. However, we must examine the other side of this diplomatic coin. In Washington, this maneuver is not being viewed as a simple exercise in trade diversification. It is being viewed as a hostile act of economic defiance. From the perspective of the Trump administration, Prime Minister Carney's actions are exactly why aggressive Section 301 tariffs were deemed necessary in the first place. Washington's counter-narrative is deeply rooted in a sense of historical fairness and national security. The administration asserts that the United States has largely subsidized the defense, security, and stability of the Western world since the end of the Second World War. They argue that allied nations like Canada and the European democracies have grown wealthy and comfortable under the protective umbrella of the U.S. military, while simultaneously hollowing out the American manufacturing base through lopsided, unfair trade agreements. The White House sees the imposition of tariffs not as coercion, but as a long-overdue, necessary correction. Their argument is straightforward. If Canada wants continued access to the most lucrative consumer market in human history, the United States, it must play by rules that explicitly prioritize American workers and American strategic interests. Furthermore, U.S. trade officials are deeply suspicious of the broader implications of this new middle power alliance. Washington fears that these middle powers are essentially constructing a massive global backdoor. The persistent concern in the U.S. Commerce Department is that heavily subsidized European goods, or components originating from adversaries like China, will be laundered through this new Canadian Nordic supply chain. They fear these products will be repackaged, stamped as Canadian, and then slipped into the United States, completely undermining the administration's protective tariff walls. To prevent this scenario, the U.S. administration is reportedly already drafting aggressive countermeasures. Policy advisors in Washington are floating the unprecedented idea of applying secondary tariffs. This means the United States would penalize not just Canada, but any nation, including the Nordics, that engages in preferential trade with Canada, that Washington deems harmful to U.S. interests. This is exactly how a bilateral border dispute spirals into a devastating global economic fracture. So we must ask, what are the real-world consequences of this escalating cycle of retaliation? How does this high-level geopolitical chess match actually impact the average citizen watching this broadcast? The human impact is going to be profound, immediate, and in many cases, painful. When international supply chains are artificially severed, rerouted, or heavily taxed for political reasons, the immediate economic result is friction. And in economics, friction almost always equals inflation. If Canadian lumber, aluminum, and critical minerals stop flowing smoothly into the United States due to reciprocal tariffs, the cost of building an American home, manufacturing an American car, and updating American infrastructure will inevitably skyrocket. Ultimately, it is the American consumer who will absorb the cost of these tariffs at the grocery store checkout and the dealership lot. On the other side of the border, the risks for Canada are existential. The Nordic countries possess highly advanced, wealthy economies, but their combined population is roughly 27 million people. They simply cannot replace the sheer volume and insatiable purchasing power of the United States, which boasts a consumer base of over 330 million people. If Prime Minister Carney miscalculates, if Washington retaliates to the Oslo summit with a full border closure or a blanket 100% tariff on all Canadian goods, the Canadian economy could plunge into a severe, devastating recession almost overnight. Hundreds of thousands of middle-class jobs in Ontario's vital automotive sector, Quebec's aerospace industry, and Alberta's energy sector hang precariously in the balance. This is a high-wire diplomatic act without a safety net. What we are witnessing is the potential definitive end of the post-Cold War consensus. For 30 years, the driving philosophy of the global order was deep integration. The prevailing belief was that if we tied our economies closely together through free trade, great power conflict would become impossible, and prosperity would be universally shared. Today, that philosophy is rapidly unraveling. We are actively returning to an era of mercantile blocs and fiercely guarded economic spheres of influence. The United States is retreating behind high tariff walls to rebuild its internal industrial strength. In direct response, allied nations are frantically forming defensive economic coalitions just to survive the fallout. The traditional institutions designed to prevent this exact scenario, such as the World Trade Organization, are increasingly paralyzed, seemingly unable to mediate between a defiant middle power coalition and an uncompromising American superpower. This leaves us with some critical, urgent questions to consider. Can a coalition of middle powers like Canada and the Nordic states truly stand up to the immense economic gravity of the United States? Is the Trump administration's hardline tariff approach a necessary, bitter medicine required to save the American working class? Or is it a catastrophic strategic blunder that will ultimately isolate the United States from its closest, most reliable allies? And most importantly, when global trade officially becomes a weapon of coercion, who truly wins the war? These are not hypothetical academic debates. The agreements being negotiated right now behind closed doors in Oslo, and the executive orders currently being drafted in Washington, will directly dictate the price of your next vehicle, the long-term security of your employment, and the balance of global power for the next 50 years. The era of easy, predictable globalization is officially over. We have entered a new volatile age of economic survivalism. We urge you to look closely at these developments. Do not just read the headlines. Strive to understand the leverage, the massive stakes, and the underlying historical forces at play. History is being rewritten in real time, and the consequences will affect every single one of us. Thank you for joining us for this special investigative report. If you value this kind of deep, analytical, and factual journalism, please subscribe to Politique News, like this video, and share your perspective in the comments below. We want to hear from you. Who do you think holds the real power in this escalating trade war? For Politique News, I'm ASTRID Carter. Keep questioning, stay informed, and we will see you next time.